Hello there, fourth period. This is a lecture on China and Japan in isolation. We started these notes on Friday. So if you already have notes and you don't need to watch this portion of the video, you can skip ahead. There are instructions on that in the class instructions that I've left today on Google Classroom. So China and the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty is a very wealthy dynasty. And they fund a lot of voyages of Zhang He, who is an explorer and sailor almost 100 years before Christopher Columbus. And he sails 7 long voyages that last, total maybe 30 years, around the Indian Ocean, exploring. He has 7 massive treasure ships, and these ships are weighted down with gold and riches from China, silk, things that are pricey, and his job is to distribute them to other kings and kingdoms that he comes into contact with to show the superiority of China and to get people to respect China more. And in exchange for this, a lot of other people from other places around the Indian Ocean, like the coast of Africa or the Middle East, give Zhang He really rare gifts to take back to the king or the emperor of China. This is an example of the Ming treasure ship compared to the caravels that Europeans were using. Now there is a film that I will link you all to, and you need to watch it to answer the questions on China and Zhang He. So make sure that you do that. So the Ming, after Zhang He dies, and after his friend the Yongle Emperor died, they decide that they don't really need to have any more contact with foreigners, because the way that they see it, they make the best stuff in the world, and they don't need to trade with anyone else, because the stuff that Europe makes is crap compared to what they do. So they don't see that trade benefits them that much, and they've already made a lot of money off of trade. The demand for Chinese goods is still really high. Their economy is still doing really well because they have had hundreds of years of really successful trade at this point. So the government decides to stop building treasure ships and stop funding these treasure distribution expeditions and start policies that favor farming over manufacturing and building up the military, expanding the size of the Great Wall of China, again, just to kind of keep foreigners out. They're also becoming increasingly more uncomfortable with Christian missionaries who are bringing European education ideas, but also Christianity to China, and it's starting to make the rulers of the government uneasy that it could become more popular than traditional Chinese religions. Now, I said that they built up the Great Wall, the Ming did. It didn't really work. About 20 years after that, the Manchu from Central Asia conquer China. They create a new dynasty. They call themselves the Qing, which is a name that comes from the Qin dynasty. And that's also where we get the word China. Qin. China. Yeah. They continue the isolationist policies of before. And they set aside special rules for foreign traders to follow. Specifically that you can't have Christianity or education or anything like that. That is seen as a threat to the Chinese. Only the Dutch of all Europeans accept these rules and are allowed to trade with the Chinese. King Si, however, is the king, or he's the emperor of China between 1661 and 1722, making him the longest ruler of China. And he conquered pretty much all of modern-day China, and was not opposed to foreign ideas. He allowed Jesuits, which is a group of Christian monks, into his court to talk about Christianity, and he did not view Western ideas as dangerous to the Chinese way of life. But I think he's the only Chinese emperor from this time period that felt that way. All right, here's the vocab that we did on Friday. If you need to pause at any point in this video to get something down, feel free to. You can do that. It is a YouTube video. So the first vocab term that you have is who led the 7 voyages for China with treasure ships, that is Zhang He. Which was the last dynasty of China, that is the Qing. And who was the longest ruling emperor in Chinese history, that is King Si. All right, so this is where we left off on Friday, talking about Japan. So let's jump into it. Between 1476 and 1573, there is a warring states period in Japan, which you can think of as like a massive gang war between lots of rival gangs. It was just utter lawlessness. Japan at the time is under a feudal system, like Europe was in the Middle Ages, and I'll post a comparison so you can see how Japanese feudalism works the exact same way that European feudalism does. Under Japanese feudalism, you have an emperor instead of a king, like they had in Europe. Europe had landlords or warlords, and the Japanese have daimyo, which is like a warlord or a landlord, and they control the military, which in feudalism in Europe were the knights, and in Japan are the samurai. They function very much the same way. They have armor, they fight on horseback, they learn to use broadsword and do hand-to-hand combat, that sort of thing. By the 1450s, European traders began arriving in Japan to start trade relations with them, and initially they're welcomed by the Japanese, and they bring Christianity and other Western ideas, which initially the Japanese do not see as a threat to their traditional ways of doing things. The Europeans also introduced guns, or firearms, to the Japanese, which changed the way that the samurai fight. In much the same way that the 100 Years' War and the introduction of the longbow and the crossbow negate the need for knights to have armor because those weapons just pierce through armor, guns do the same thing in Japan. So you can see here, these are samurai, but they're no longer wearing like head-to-toe armor because guns can pierce through that. In 1568, Oda Nobunaga kind of ends feudalism by unifying Japan under himself. He seizes the capital city of Kyoto, but he dies before he can unify the entire island of Japan. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who is Oda Nobunaga's good friend, finishes the unification of Japan, subdues the warlords or the daimyo under his control, takes control of their militaries, establishes a dynasty called the Tokugawa shogunate. Tokugawa is his last name. Shogunate is like a military dictatorship. In 1639, the Tokugawa decides to close Japan off to foreigners, the way that China did. And they start to limit trade to just the port of Nagasaki. And eventually, they only start allowing the Dutch and the Chinese to trade at all, and only from that port. Now, if Nagasaki sounds familiar, that is because it was a target of one of the atomic bombs in World War II. Nagasaki has always been very important to the Japanese as far as trade goes, and it continued to be important up until World War II, which is why it was a target. The Japanese banned Christianity in 1639, so anyone who is converted to Christianity may no longer practice it. And they also start forbidding people in Japan to travel abroad because they don't want the Japanese necessarily to be introduced to European ideas. And Japan starts to develop in isolation, much the same way that China did. And this is a problem for both countries because what it means is that they're not going to compete with other countries or be introduced to new ideas as they evolve. And so it's going to be harder for them to fight off Europeans in the 1900s. All right, vocabulary. Go back to that. And remember, you can pause if you need to. Who is the Japanese daimyo who seized the capital city of Kyoto in his unification effort? That is Oda Nobunaga. And which dynasty began in Japan in 1603 with isolationist policies? That is the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, there is, let me go back here, a section at the end of your notes on a film guide for a movie called The Warriors. And if I can find it. I am going to go through those answers now instead of having you watch the video because the video is an hour long and we just do not have time to do it. So the first question is, samurai are Japanese, and the answer to number 1 is knights. They are the Japanese knights. Number 2 says the greatest samurai of them all was Tokugawa Ieyasu. So he's the greatest of these warriors. Number 3 says the way of the warrior puts loyalty loyalty above all things. That's called the Bushido Code, but you don't necessarily need to know how to spell that right now. Number 3 is loyalty. Number 4, what choice does the Ieyasu give Mitsunari? Mitsunari is a rebellious samurai under Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Ieyasu says to his friend who has betrayed him, you can be exiled, or say that you tried to murder me and dishonor yourself. And honor and loyalty are very important in Japan. So number 7 says, sorry, where am I? Not number 7. Number 5 says, it looked like I would take control of Japan through politics. Politics is the answer, not war. So what Mitsunari does is he kills himself because he is dishonored because he attempted to murder his friend and commander. So suicide is very common in Japanese military orders throughout history. After Ieyasu has subdued a lot of his... Let's go back a little bit. After he subdues a lot of the daimyo and establishes his shogunate, he starts to create a political order. So that's where number 5 comes from, the politics. He marries daimyo's families to one another. They have adoptions and things like that so that the daimyo stop fighting with each other because they're all related to each other. And he gives them like high up political positions so they're less likely to rebel against him like Mitsunari did. Number 6 says, how does Mitsunari get Hideaki to change sides? Well, when he's plotting against the Tokugawa, he tries to tell Taiko that when Ieyasu wins, he will kill all of them. So he sways this guy named Hideaki to change sides and to help him, Mitsunari, kill the Tokugawa Ieyasu. So number 7 says, Motodara, because he lost his Fushimi castle in a battle, followed the way of the warrior. Well, what that means is that he kills himself, which is something that all of these other people who have dishonored themselves are going to do in this movie. It's all about Japanese suicide. Number 8 says, why did Ieyasu's son, what did he have to do to 20 years before to prove his loyalty? He also had to kill himself. That's number 8. Number 9, the Battle of Sekikara was the biggest gathering of samurai in Japanese history, and they have guns. Number 10 says what happened to Mitsunari. Well, he's killed in that battle. Number 11 says what happened to Taiko. He led an uprising, he lost, and he killed himself, because that is something that just happens in Japanese military orders. And then 12, what title did the Tokugawa Ieyasu take? Well, he took on the title of Shogun. He's the Shogun of Tokugawa. Alright, so that's all for that video. Make sure you watch the one on the treasure ships, and I will see you all tomorrow.